So in this lesson, we're going to look at matter and energy flow in ecosystems. So the learning intention, so students should be able to explain how matter and energy flows through ecosystems. So the first thing we want to think about are these two terms, what we call, so if we take matter, so matter basically it's like the building blocks of everything. Matter consists of atoms, and atoms have two kind of properties, if you like. They have mass and they have volume. Okay, so they take up a definite amount of space. Now, in relation to, so if we have a look here, so this is an ecosystem, and everything that's in this ecosystem, the sun, the tree, the animals, the decomposers, they are all made up of atoms. So you can think about them like collections of atoms all joined together, in different forms. But so that is matter. And then there's this principle here that relates to matter. It's called conservation of mass. So basically, what that means is that mass can neither be created or destroyed, but it is transformed from one form into another. So what happens is, like you can't get rid of matter. Matter is basically recycled and reused. So the building blocks that make up us and everything that's in the universe, they're constantly being recycled, and they're as old as the universe is. The matter that's in it, the atoms that are in our bodies, for example. So that is matter, and then this is the like a principle that relates to matter, and this is important when we think about the flow of matter and energy through an ecosystem. The other thing then that we have is energy. So energy, if we remember, energy is the ability to do work. Okay, so basically with energy we can do work. So we can do things like keep our bodies warm, move around, observe our environment, etc., etc. And that all needs energy. And if we remember, energy is measured in joules. So energy is the ability to do work, and energy can exist in many different, so it has many different forms. You can say that matter can exist in many forms as well. So forms, like it can exist as a tree, it can exist as a rabbit, it can exist as a sun, etc. And energy then as well, it has many forms. So you can have like chemical energy, for example, is the energy stored inside the chemicals of a bond, like in glucose. You can have nuclear energy, like the energy that's radiated for the sun. You can have heat and you can have light energy. So energy, you can have sound energy. So energy can exist in many different forms. Now, again, energy is not destroyed. So what happens is we have this principle, which is called the conservation of energy. So energy cannot be created or destroyed, but only changed from one form into another. So we have these two, so we have matter and then we have energy, and this makes up everything that's in the universe. So matter is like the building blocks, and then energy is like that, is the stuff that makes matter do all the things that it does. So for example, if it's an animal, it makes it move around, it makes it eat, it makes it observe its environment, etc., etc. So these two principles, these two, like energy and matter, are very important, and then these two laws, if you like, that relate to energy and matter are very important as well. And they're particularly important when it comes to what we're going to talk about now, which is the how energy and matter, how it flows through an ecosystem. And just as a high level, you can think about this as a cycle of life. So for example, if we take energy, ultimately all energy comes from the sun. So for example, the sun is a nuclear reaction that's happening in space, and it's dumping out loads of energy in the form of light and heat into space, into the space around it. That light and heat is making its way to the earth, and then on the earth, then what happens is that energy is taken up by organisms such as trees and such as grass. And what they do is they carry out this process of photosynthesis, and they trap that energy. Now, the next two really important things in relation to this is, so we have this process of what's called the photosynthesis. So we have this important process here, and I've just written it out, what that's called photosynthesis. So essentially what happens is the light from the sun, and along with the glucose that's in the, or along with the chlorophyll, should I say, the part that gives green plants the green color, what it does is it's able to take in carbon dioxide from the air around it, and it's able to take in water, for example, through its root system. And what it's able to do is take these two molecules and trap the energy from the sun that comes in the form of light and trap it in glucose molecules like this. And then what it does is it releases oxygen into the environment. So what's happening here is the energy from the sun is being trapped by the plant, and it's been changed into, so it's been stored in the plant in the form of glucose. The light energy has been stored as glucose, and then oxygen is released into the environment. And then what happens then is animals come along, like if we take, for example, rabbits, and what they do is they eat plants. So when they eat the plants, why are they eating the plants? Well, they're eating the plants because they want to get access to this glucose that's in the plants, because they want energy. Why do they want energy? Because they want to exist. They want to do all the things that rabbits do, and in order to do that, they need energy. So then what we have is when we have consumers like this um, that eat plants, okay, that are able to trap the energy from the sun, what they do is they carry out this process, which is called respiration. So they take the glucose into their digestive system, they take in oxygen through their breathing system, and what they do is they're able to burn both of these chemicals together inside their cells, and they're able to extract the energy from the sun that was trapped in the glucose, and they're able to use that energy then to do all the things that, for example, rabbits do. And what happens then is that they recycle these other molecules back into the environment, like carbon dioxide and like H2O, like water. And then what happens is this goes back into this cycle. So there's this constant cycle. So not only have you got energy that's flowing through this system, but you also have matter in the form of these molecules flowing through this system as well. And if we take a rabbit or a fox or any other animal, for example, when it carries out respiration, what it does is it loses heat to the environment. So some of this chemical energy is converted into heat energy. And it's the same for us as well. Our bodies are hot, and the reason they're hot is because of this chemical reaction. That's why. And what the body does is it releases this heat energy back into the environment. So we get this movement of heat and heat energy out of the bodies, for example, of all of the organisms consume um, that consume like plants or other animals. So we have the herbivores that eat other plants, and then we have the carnivores that eat the herbivores. And then what we have is when any of these, so when the plants or the herbivores or the carnivores die, you have decomposers, for example, bacteria and mushrooms and fungi that get onto the dead body and they start to break it down as well. And what they do is they are like nature's recyclers. So you have this, you can think about all of life as this massive cycle that's just continuing on and on and on. And what's being cycled is energy and matter is being cycled through this whole system. So we're going to look at these individually in a bit of detail. So matter can exist as abiotic chemicals. So abiotic means they're not alive. So for example, matter can exist as rocks, or it can exist as like non-living things. So remember, and matter, this is what matter is. Matter is everything, like it's the building blocks of everything. It's the atoms that make up everything. So that can exist in different forms. It can exist as a person. It can exist as abiotic chemicals or non-living like things like rocks or minerals. It can exist as plants. Matter can exist as animals, and humus matter is constantly recycled and reused. So the atoms that make up our body, for example, were atoms that were probably used in the bodies of loads of other organisms before we decided to start using the matter to make up our bodies. So, and when we die and when we pass away, the matter that's in our body will be recycled into the environment, and it'll be reused, for example, then by the environment. So rocks and minerals break down to release nutrients such as nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus into the soil and some are taken up by plants. So again, you have minerals that break down and they get into the soil, for example, and these minerals such as nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, etc. So what can happen? Let me just zoom out a little bit here because I kind of want to keep these here in your mind as we're going through this. So again, what can happen is if we take, imagine this is the ground, and what you can have then is you can have, let's say, in the form of like rocks. What can happen is these rocks can break down into the ground. So they break down and they go into the ground, and they release things like phosphorus, they release things like nitrogen and calcium into the ground. And then what can happen then is if we have a plant, for example, that's here, imagine this is some kind of a plant, and it has a root system, and that root system will take up these nutrients from the environment, for example. And what that plant will do is it'll take that matter that was in the form of an abiotic, non-living thing, and it takes it up into its body, and then that matter, those atoms, they become part of this plant, for example. So what's happening is the material is being recycled into the plant. So plants can use these nutrients along with water, carbon dioxide to form biomolecules such as carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and vitamins. So basically all it's doing is taking these elements and joining them together to make these more complicated molecules like carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and vitamins. And that's essentially like what makes up the body of the plant. So it can take in, for example, CO2 from the air, and it can take in water, H2O, from the ground. Okay, and then we can have, for example, energy from the sun. And what will happen is it'll go through this process here of photosynthesis as well. And it can make things like glucose, so it can, and then also through other chemical processes, it can make other compounds like fats and vitamins and proteins, and these are the things that are used to make up the body of the plant and all the different functions and parts of the plant. So again, you have this constant recycling that's happening. So when one organism eats another organism, it receives all its biomolecules and nutrients. So this is an inanimate object. It has released minerals into the ground. The plant has taken all that up. It's taken up in water, taken in carbon dioxide, and all of that is inside the plant. And then if something comes along and eats this, okay, so some animal, like let's say a cow or something, comes along, and this is my really bad drawing of a cow. So a cow comes along and it eats that. Essentially what it's doing is it's taking all of these nutrients into its body. So nutrients can be returned into the soil as humus when organisms die and are broken down by decomposers. After many years, the nutrients can be compressed into rocks again, such as limestone. So again, what will inevitably happen is the plant and the animal will die off, and then in the ground you have like things like bacteria, you have mushrooms, and you can have fungi. And these things are like recyclers, or they're decomposers. And basically what they'll do is they will break down the dead matter and turn it into this, like what's called humus. And then what can happen is over time, these materials can be compressed back into rocks, for example, or they can be taken up by and then they'll be recycled back into the ground, taken up by other plants, taken up by animals. They die and then they recycle. So this constant recycling is happening all the time. And what's being passed from one thing into another is matter, for example. The atoms are being passed from one organism to the next, and the cycle just keeps going on and on and on. The next thing then is energy. So energy from the sun. So the sun provides the energy for all life on Earth. So essentially all of life on Earth, and the energy for it comes from the sun. So in this example here that we've looked at, so you have the sun. So all of the energy that exists on the earth, it comes from the sun. So that's why the sun is very, very important. It gives basically all the energy to the earth. Okay, that's why like the sun is really important, and that's why like humans are interested in this whole cycle, because we like to understand how it all works and how it all fits together. So the sun provides the energy for all life on earth and all of earth's ecosystems. So if we look at something like this here, we have a system. So basically you have plants and animals that all rely on each other for survival. And essentially what all these plants and animals are doing is they're just transporting energy from the sun, and they're trapping it in their cells in the form of glucose, and then they're passing it on to each other when they are consumed by each other. And then it's also energy then is also being released into the environment by all these organisms in the form of heat. So remember, when respiration happens, it gives off this energy, and all animals will give off heat, for example, and it's lost into the environment as heat energy. So when animals eat plants, they eat this food formed. Sorry. So when animals eat plants, they eat this food formed from energy originally provided by the sun. So again, the plants take the energy from the sun, and through the process of photosynthesis, they trap the energy from the sun, and then what happens in the form of glucose, and then animals like other animals come along and they eat the plant, and they also eat the glucose, and then they take the energy from the plant that the plant has stored, that the energy the plant has trapped from light from the sun. So then what's happening is, you can think about the energy from the sun is being passed into the plant energy, the energy then from the plant is being passed into the animal, the energy from this animal is being passed on to the next animal when they eat it. So the sun's energy is thus passed along to them. So you can think about it like the energy from the sun is being passed through this whole ecosystem. In this way, the sun's energy fuels every living thing. So basically, like everything. So why are plants photosynthesizing and taking energy from the sun? Well, they need that energy in order to do the work that they need to do to keep their form and to carry out all the functions that they carry out. Why are animals eating plants? Because they need to get the glucose, because they need the energy to do all the work to keep their form, to keep their bodies functioning, etc. And that's why we eat as well, to keep our bodies functioning and to keep the form that we have. So in this way then, the sun energy fuels every living thing on the planet. So if you didn't have any sun, you wouldn't have any photosynthesis. If you didn't have any photosynthesis, you wouldn't have any glucose being made and respiration. If you didn't have any respiration, you're not going to have any, not necessarily going to have complex life like what we have now on the earth. So now what we want to think about are inside the ecosystem, the different types. So what we can do is we can start to split up the different types of groups that we have inside the ecosystem. So the first groups, if you like, we have what are called producers and we have consumers. So plants such as grass and trees are called producers because they produce or make their own food. So for example, plants have this ability to photosynthesize, and as a result of that, they have the ability to make their own food or make glucose. So they actually use the glucose and you burn it as respiration to carry out all the functions that the plant needs to do. But plants have this ability to take the energy from the sun, take molecules in the environment around them, like carbon dioxide and water, combine them together and make their own food in the form of glucose. So not all animals have the ability to do that, but plants have the ability to do that, and animals that can do that are called producers because they actually produce their own food. Animals are called consumers because they consume or they eat food but do not produce it on their own. So for example, we are consumers and other animals are consumers, like this fox here, or like the rabbits that are in its mouth. So they're consumers. Why are they consumers? Because they have to consume either plants or other animals to get the glucose in order to carry out respiration and get their energy. So we can break up the consumers then into two types. So you have the primary consumers, or herbivores, such as rabbits. They eat plants only. So herbivores are animals that eat only plants. So for example, you have the herbivores here, and they eat the plants. Okay, so and they are called primary because they're the first, if you like. So this is like, you can think about the producers as the main source of energy and food, and then what happens is the primary consumers are the first ones that kind of so they're able to digest plants, for example, and they're able to take the energy out of the plants and extract them. Secondary consumers then, such as foxes, eat the primary consumers. So this guy here is a secondary consumer, and we are secondary consumers. Well, we're primary and secondary consumers, and basically foxes, for example, would be an example of a secondary consumer. So what they do is they consume herbivores, so they're prey animals and they eat herbivores as well. They do that to get their energy. So we have the producers, we have the primary consumers, and then we have the secondary consumers. So then within these you have what are called herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. So herbivores are animals whose primary food source is plant-based. So some examples of herbivores include vertebrates like deers, koalas, and some bird species. So vertebrates means that they have like a spine. Basically, that's what a vertebrate is. So you have things like deers, birds species, as well as invertebrates. So these are animals that don't have a spine, such as crickets and caterpillars. Okay, so again, these are all what are called herbivores. Why are they herbivores? Because they eat plants. These animals have evolved digestive systems capable of handling large amounts of plant material. So these animals, their digestive system has evolved so that they're actually able to eat plants. Like we can't eat plants to the same extent as these herbivores because our digestive system is designed to eat other food sources. Now we can eat some plants, but not, like for example, we wouldn't be able to extract all the energy from grass if we were to try and go out and eat grass. So carnivores then are animals that eat other animals. So the word carnivore is derived from the Latin and literally means meat eater. So wild cats such as lions, tigers are examples of vertebrates. So again, vertebrates are animals that have spines. Carnivores such as snakes and sharks, while invertebrate carnivores include sea stars, spiders, and ladybugs as well. So these are all like spiders, for example, eat. They are what are called carnivores. They're meat eaters. And then we have what are called omnivores. So we are omnivores, for example. Omnivores eat both. So omnivores are animals that eat both plants and animal derived food. So in Latin, omnivore means eat everything. So humans, bears, and chickens are examples of vertebrates. So vertebrates are animals with spines. Omnivores, invertebrate omnivores include cockroaches and crayfish. So again, they eat, like cockroaches will eat anything, and the same then with crayfish as well. They can eat plants and they can eat animals as well. So they're the three kind of groups, if you like, what are called herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, and it's based on what they eat. Herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat meat, omnivores eat plants and meat. So energy transfer in food chains and energy loss in food chains. So this here is an example of a food chain. So it just shows, for example, how energy or matter passes from one group to the next. So sunlight is the main source of energy in an ecosystem. So again, remember, all of the energy ultimately comes from sun. So the energy from the grass, for example, it gets its energy from the sun. Organisms that make their own food are called autotrophs. Okay, so plant flora are produced as they make their own foods. Okay, so autotrophs, this is a word, and what it basically means is that the organism has the ability to make its own food. So as an example of that, grass would be what's called an autotroph. So heterotrophs then, so autotrophs make their own food. Heterotrophs are organisms that are not able to make their own food. So they basically can't make their own food, and they must get food from other organisms. So for example, the rabbit here and the fox are two examples of heterotrophs. They're not able to make their own food, so the rabbit has to eat the grass, the fox has to eat the rabbit in order to be able to get food, for example, to get everything that it needs to keep its body functioning and healthy. So animals or fauna are consumers as they feed on other organisms. So animals generally what they do is they feed on other organisms, so they are what are called consumers. So all food chains begin with a producer. So we have the producers and then we have the consumers. So all food chains begin with producers such as plants, Grazing food chain nutrients are passed by feeding from producers to primary consumers and then to secondary consumers. So this is a food chain. Here is your primary producer, which is the grass, and all food chains start with a primary producer. Then you have your primary consumer, which is the one that eats the primary producer, and then you have the secondary consumer, which is the one that eats the primary consumer. Okay, so this is an example. And this is what's called a food chain. And basically what we're looking at here is the movement of energy and matter through an ecosystem, through these animals. So we want to think about then, we're talking about energy and we're talking about this principle, energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it's just changed from one form into another. So we want to think about like, how does energy actually flow through an ecosystem? So how does this energy, how does it move through like an ecosystem like this? So only about 10% of the energy passed from organism to organism in a food chain. Okay, so like if you think about that, that's a very small percentage. 90% of the energy is lost, but only about 10% is passed from one organism to the next. This means about 90% of the energy is lost at each step. As a result, food chains cannot be too long, as there will be very little energy at the end of a long food chain. So energy is lost from ecosystems mainly as heat. So we talked about here, so energy, for example, is passed on to the tree. Only 10% of the energy that's passed on from the sun is taken up by the tree. The rest is lost as heat. Then what happens is when the herbivore eats the tree or eats the grass, the grass, for example, only 10% of the energy that's inside the grass is going to be passed on to the herbivore. And then when the fox eats the rabbit, again, only 10% of the energy is passed on to the fox. So the food chains can't be too long, because what will happen is there will not be much energy left at the end of the food chain. So energy flow and loss in a food chain. So again, this is just another example of this. So we have our grass. So 10% of the energy is passed on to whatever organism eats it, and then 90% of the energy is lost, for example, as heat. So the plants are giving off heat and they're losing that energy to the environment. So the rabbit consumes it, it only gets 10% of the energy, and then it gets 10%, and then what happens then is it can only pass on 10% of what it got, and the rest of it, 90%, is lost as heat. So if you think about the rabbit, for example, it's going to be carrying out respiration. It's going to be burning glucose, using oxygen, and then what's going to happen is a lot of that energy, it's going to just radiate off its body as heat. And then if a fox comes along and eats the rabbit, again, what's happening is it's only getting 10% of the energy from here. So you're constantly getting this loss of energy in the ecosystem in the form of heat. It's just been radiated back into the environment. So that's the energy transfer through the ecosystem. So the next one we want to think about matter transport in food chains. So biomass is the mass of living biological organisms. So for example, if we take like a section of grass, it's made up of matter and it's in the form of grass, and then that has a particular mass, okay, because that's one of the properties of matter. So biomass is the mass of living biological organisms. So for example, the tree will have a mass, the grass will have mass, the rabbits will have mass, etc. So the atoms that make up the organism in a living ecosystem are cycled repeatedly between the living and non-living parts of the ecosystem. So remember, we have this principle, conservation of mass. Mass can neither be created or destroyed, but is transformed from one form into another, and that's what's happening in an ecosystem like this. So you have the non-living parts that's transferring mass to the living parts, and then the living parts are transferring mass between each other. So biomass is transferred from producer to consumer in food chains. So we talked about these food chains, and biomass is being transferred from producers to consumers in food chains. Biomass can be lost between stages because not all of the matter eaten by an organism is digested. So some of it is excreted as waste, such as solid feces, carbon dioxide and water in respiration, and water and urea in urea. So when organisms, so for example, when a plant, like when a rabbit eats grass, for example, not all of the biomass will be transferred into the rabbit's body. So what's going to happen is the rabbit's going to lose some of the atoms that it ate that make up the grass. It's going to lose it in the form of, like, when it breathes out, it'll CO2 and water vapor, and then when it gets rid of waste it can't digest into the environment, it's going to lose mass. So just like the way only 10% of energy is transferred from one part of the ecosystem to the next, it's the same with matter as well. Only a fraction of the atoms that make up the grass, for example, are transferred into the rabbit when the rabbit eats the grass. So decomposers recycle nutrients from dead plants or animals matter back to the soil in terrestrial environments or to the water in aqueous environments as well. So if we have a look at this example here, so we can see, let's say we have so we've 10,000 kg or 1,000 kgs of mass, let's say, in the form of grass as producers. Then we have these primary consumers, and when they eat this grass, they only, if you like, the amount of mass that they take from the grass into their body is only 100 kg. The rest of it is lost, as like what we mentioned here. And then what will happen then is, again, these will be consumed by primary carnivores, and again only like 10% will be taken on in here from these guys, and then the same up the food chain then as well. So we can see that not all of the mass is being transferred up through the food chain. A lot of it is being lost back into the environment. And that's why food chains have to be small, because they can only take, like, there's only so much mass and energy that can be transferred up through the food chains. And this is like the example of that. So ways then that we can represent food chains, then we have a pyramid of numbers. So trophic levels is the feeding level of an organism in a food chain. So we can think about each of these levels as what are called trophic levels. So a pyramid of numbers shows the number of organisms at each trophic level of the food chain. So in the pyramid of numbers shown, there are less rabbits than grass plants and less foxes than rabbits. So if we have a look at this, so this is a pyramid by numbers. So in this food chain or ecosystem, we can see that there's more grass, for example, than rabbits. Why? Because this is physically bigger down here. And then you have rabbits, okay, and then there's more rabbits than foxes. Okay, so as you go up through this pyramid, the number of the organisms reduces. So for example, at the bottom, that's the trophic level, if you like, that has the most number of organisms. An inverted pyramid of numbers starts with a single large producer, such as a tree, or can end with many small consumers, such as parasites. So if we take this one here, so this is what's called an inverted pyramid. So it's starting off with like an oak tree, that's the producer. Then on the oak tree, so imagine it's like an oak tree, something like this. And then in that tree, then you have caterpillars. Okay, so they're consuming the plants or the leaves of the tree. And then imagine then inside the caterpillar, then you might have some kind of parasitic worm that's living off the caterpillar. And then above that, then you have thrushes that eat the caterpillars, and as a result eat the parasitic worms as well. So this is an example of an inverted pyramid. But again, if you look at the sizes, it shows that, oak trees, there's less oak trees than there are caterpillars. There are less caterpillars than there are parasitic worms, and then there are less thrushes than there are parasitic worms and caterpillars. Okay, so again, the size of these pyramids determine, like, let's say the number, for example, that are in each of the pyramids. So again, this is just a nice way to represent a food chain. Then we have another way to represent a food chain, and it looks like this, and this is what's called a food web. So a food web shows many food chains with links in common. So in this food web, the oak tree is the primary producer. So this is the oak tree. Herbivores such as mouse eats only plants, and carnivores such as hawks eat only animals. So if we take, for example, we can see here that the mouse, okay, consumes parts of the oak tree, for example. We can see that the mouse also consumes blackberries here as well, donated by these by these arrows here, and then we can see then that the hawk, for example, eats the mouse, and the hawk also eats thrushes as well. Now we can see in this food chain as well that the thrush eats caterpillars and it eats blackberries as well. So therefore you can say that a thrush it's a secondary consumer because it eats these guys here, and then it's also a primary consumer because it eats the blackberries as well. So the thrushes both. If all the thrushes died, the caterpillars would increase in number because they would have no predator. So for example, if this guy died off, what would happen is this population would increase. Why would it increase? Because it has no like predator, for example, that's keeping it in check. And what would probably happen then is that the hawk population would reduce because it wouldn't have its primary food source. So if as a result of pollution a species of plant disappeared from an ecosystem, then there may be a drop in the number of herbivores that feed on that plant. There may be an increase in the number of other plants that compete for it then as well. So if if the oak tree, for example, died off, that would have a massive impact on the whole food web. And what would happen is other plants that are better able to survive in the environment would thrive because it wouldn't be competing against the oak tree for things like space and light. So that is the lesson. So we have looked at, so students should be able to explain how matter and energy flow through an ecosystem. So we've talked about how energy and matter flows through the ecosystem. So thank you for listening.